Welcome to our second episode of Gender Trouble, the podcast where we dive deep into Judith Butler's iconic challenge to identity, normativity, and the very meaning of gender. In this series, we explore how gender isn't what we are, but what we do, again and again.
And in this deep dive, we're really getting into the thick of it right from the start. We're focusing on the first major section of Gender Trouble called Subjects of Sex, Gender, Desire. That's pages 3 to 44.
Okay, yeah, let's jump right in. So the mission today really is to unpack Butler's initial big argument. She claims that these categories we often just accept, like sex, gender, things feminism has leaned on, well, maybe they aren't so solid or natural.
Exactly. She argues they're actually constructed by power, and they're much more shaky than we tend to think.
Right. This is where she really lays the groundwork for questioning, these foundational ideas about identity we hold.
Absolutely. It's foundational work.
So almost immediately, Butler poses this really central question. Can feminism actually rely on women as a stable kind of universal category for its politics?
It feels like it has to, doesn't it? I mean, who else is feminism for?
That's the intuitive thought. But Butler says, hang on, let's look at how that category women even gets formed.
Yeah, and this is fascinating. She talks about juridical power, like legal systems. It doesn't just make rules for people who are already there.
It does more.
It actually produces the very idea of the subject it claims to represent, and then it sort of hides that production.
Wait, say that again? Power creates the subject. It's not just controlling existing people.
That's the core idea. Think about law. It sets up the notion of a subject before the law, makes it seem natural, like this subject just exists, ready to be governed.
So that legitimizes the law's own power.
Precisely. So the very concept of person who can be regulated is, you could say, an effect of the regulatory system itself.
So even women, which feels so real, might be more of an effective power structures than some kind of pre-existing group that power then acts upon.
That's exactly her argument. And then think about the idea that all women share some universal experience.
That's always tricky.
Right. The text points out there are debates, even within feminism. Does any commonality come before oppression? Or is it the shared experience of oppression that creates a kind of commonality?
And once you factor in class, race, sexuality, all these other intersecting aspects of who we are,
the idea of one single, stable identity for all women starts to look, well, inadequate. Butler suggests identity itself might be the wrong word here, a misnomer.
Okay, so this leads her to ask, what if feminist politics doesn't assume women as this unified starting point? What happens then?
Maybe, she suggests, political representation could work differently, perhaps better, even if the subject isn't presumed from the get-go.
Okay, that's a lot to chew on just about the subject women. Let's shift to that other big distinction. Sex is biological, gender is cultural. That's the standard model, yeah.
That's the one we all learn, the common sense view. But here comes Butler's really radical challenge in this section. What of biological sex? What if it's already gendered?
Whoa. Okay. Sex is already gendered. How does that work? Biology as culture?
Well, her argument is that gender isn't just this cultural layer you add onto some neutral biological base called sex.
Right.
Instead, gender is the very apparatus, the system, that produces the idea of a natural sex or a sex nature and makes it seem like it exists before culture.
So the belief that sex is just a neutral scientific fact outside culture, that belief itself is produced by the cultural system of gender.
Yes. According to Butler, establishing sex as prior to culture is a really effective way to make it seem fixed, stable, and crucially binary, just male or female.
And unchanging.
So rethinking gender means we have to understand how it actually creates this effect of a prediscursive natural sex. It's like the tools we use to measure something actually help define the thing being measured.
Okay. This really connects to Simone de Beauvoir, doesn't it?
Yeah.
One is not born a woman, but rather becomes one.
Beauvoir is absolutely key here. That idea of becoming clearly points to gender being constructed. But Butler pushes further. She asks, does constructed mean there's some agent, some I, that exists before the becoming who then sort of chooses or adopts a gender?
Beauvoir does say this becoming is compelled by culture. It's not like a free choice based on biology.
Exactly. And Butler highlights something really interesting in Beauvoir's wording. One becomes a woman. That one isn't necessarily biologically female from the start.
Right, because Beauvoir sees the body as a situation, always interpreted through cultural meanings. So sex itself can't be purely pre-cultural if our understanding of it is always mediated.
Precisely. So from that angle, what we call sex seems to have been shaped by gender all along.
But Butler also critiques Beauvoir, right? Suggesting she might fall back into a kind of mind-body split.
She does raise that concern. That old Cartesian dualism mind, separate from body, has historically propped up gender hierarchies, associating mind with masculinity, body with femininity.
Seeing mind as universal, body as particular.
Yes. And Butler reads Beauvoir as implicitly asking how masculinity achieves that position of seeming like the disembodied universal default, often by projecting embodiment onto the feminine.
Interesting. Okay, before we dive into performance, there was that brief point about political coalitions. If we can't rely on a fixed identity like women, how do people organize politically?
Yeah, it's a practical question. The text suggests coalition doesn't actually need prior unity. It can be built through acknowledging differences and contradictions.
So, not starting with assumptions.
Right. An anti-foundational approach means you don't assume identity is the premise, and you don't know the final shape of the coalition in advance. It allows for more flexibility.
Okay, let's shift gears now to section 2, and this huge idea of gender as performance. Monique Wittig comes in here.
Wittig's work is really important for Butler. Wittig argues forcefully that the whole binary system of sex exists to serve compulsory heterosexuality.
And that breaking free from compulsory heterosexuality might mean breaking free from sex and gender categories altogether.
Wittig explores that, yeah. She suggests getting rid of compulsory heterosexuality might free the person, or that maybe a proliferation of different erotic ways of being could just dissolve these illusions of fixed identity, sex, and gender.
And she has that really striking idea about the lesbian maybe being a third gender or something outside the whole system of sex?
Yes, for Wittig, the lesbian figure stands outside the heterosexual contract that defines man and woman in relation to each other. So she argues lesbian is uniquely positioned to critique the category of sex itself. It's a kind of self-determining subject.
This critique of fixed categories then leads Butler to draw on philosophy, particularly Nietzsche, and this idea of the metaphysics of substance. Sounds heavy.
It does sound a bit abstract, but the basic idea is pretty straightforward. Think about how we tend to assume there's a stable thing, a substance, an essence, a core self, behind all the actions and attributes we observe.
Like a fixed me inside that does things.
Exactly, a stable psychological person. Nietzsche, and Butler, following him, suggest this might be an illusion, partly encouraged by grammar, subject, verb, object. The subject seems like a stable entity doing the action. It imposes a kind of artificial order.
So applying this to gender, Butler's questioning if there's really a fixed internal gender identity that then causes our gender expressions.
Precisely, and she uses Foucault's reading of Herculin Barbin's journals here.
The intersex individual.
Right. Foucault presented Herculin not as someone with a hidden true identity, but as embodying the sexual impossibility of an identity. Her existence just didn't fit the rules trying to neatly link sex, gender, and desire.
Foucault saw Herculin as suggesting maybe we should think in terms of accidental attributes, like fleeting pleasures, desires, without needing some solid substance underneath.
Yes. The whole notion of a fixed identity, in this view, becomes a kind of regulatory fiction. It's a way society imposes order and hierarchy, not necessarily a reflection of reality.
Okay, so this leads us right to the core, probably the most famous takeaway from this part of the book. If identity is a fiction, if there's no substance, what is gender?
The radical conclusion is gender isn't an internal noun, something you have. The feeling that gender is a core substance, part of who you are, that feeling is actually performatively produced and compelled by the regulatory practices of gender coherence.
Okay, and that brings us to the quote, the one everyone knows from page 33.
The crucial line. There is no gender identity behind the expressions of gender. That identity is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its results.
Let's unpack that because it really flips things. It's not identity causes expression.
No.
It's the expressions, the repeated actions, the way we do gender according to social norms that creates this sense of having an identity in the first place.
Exactly that. Gender is a doing. But crucially, it's not done by a subject who existed fully formed before the doing.
The subject is an effect.
The feeling of being a subject with a gender identity is an effect of the performance. It's like Nietzsche's example. Lightning flashes. We invent the idea of lightning as the thing that did the flashing. But the flash is the event. There's no doer behind the deed in that sense.
And Wittig's ideas reinforce this too, right? Calling sex itself a mythic construction.
Absolutely. Wittig emphasizes language here, calling it another order of materiality. The act of repeatedly naming people, dividing them into male, female, man, woman, using language. That very act creates the appearance of a natural division.
So men and women become, as Wittig says, political categories and not natural facts.
Exactly. Created and reinforced through repeated social and linguistic acts.
So, important clarification. This performance isn't like consciously acting on a stage. It's not necessarily deliberate pretending.
No, not usually. It's more about the ongoing, often unconscious repetition of norms that are embedded in our social world. These repeated actions produce the effect of a stable gender.
And the text argues that this strict binary system actually papers over a lot of messiness, right? Fluidity and contradictions that already exist in people's lives and desires.
Yes, whether people identify as straight, gay, bi, whatever, the neat binary often doesn't capture the complexity.
So those moments that don't fit the cultural configurations of gender confusion, as the text calls them, they can actually challenge the system.
They become potential sites of resistance or disruption. Because the apparent unity of gender isn't natural, it's the effect of regulatory practices, mainly compulsory heterosexuality trying to line everything up neatly. Sex, gender, desire.
Power maintains itself through repetition.
But Butler suggests that repetition is also vulnerable. You can have subversive repetition repeating gender norms in ways that highlight their constructedness, that twist them, that create gender trouble.
Okay, let's zoom out. We've covered a lot of ground in these first 44 pages. For you listening, why does this deep dive matter? What's the takeaway?
Well, this fundamental challenge to sex and gender as just being natural facts, it really shifts how you might understand yourself and the social rules around you.
If gender isn't something you inherently are, but something you do under compulsion from social norms, what does that tell us about those norms?
It shows how powerful they are, often invisibly shaping our lives, our expectations, our very sense of self.
And it highlights that power isn't just negative telling us no. It's productive. It actively produces the categories like sex and gender that we live by.
Right. So the key takeaway from this opening section is that Butler is showing how our most basic identity categories are regulatory fictions. They feel real, but they're maintained by power, especially, she argues, compulsory heterosexuality and masculine dominance.
Gender is a performance, an enactment that creates the effective identity.
And the goal, hinted at here, is to make gender trouble, to disrupt these seemingly natural categories. This really sets the stage for everything else in the book.
Absolutely. Later on, we'll see how she brings in psychoanalysis, ideas about the body, to flesh out this picture of how gender gets constructed and internalized.
It gets even more complex.
Definitely. So as we wrap up this exploration of the start of gender trouble, here's a thought to leave you with. If sex isn't a natural fact, but more like a mythic construction, as Wittig puts it, enforced by society, why does our own gender often feel so incredibly real, so fundamental to who we are? Where does that powerful feeling originate, if not from biology?
And building on that, if gender is this compelled performance, what kinds of everyday performances might you notice yourself doing, maybe how you sit or talk or dress, that reinforce these norms? And conversely, are there small ways, subversive repetitions, you could imagine playing with those norms, disrupting them even slightly, to open up different possibilities?
Yeah, finally consider this. Maybe identity isn't something static inside you that you just need to discover. What if it's something constantly being produced, moment by moment, through your actions, your interactions, the norms you navigate, even the language you use? What does that change about how you think about your own agency, your freedom, and its limits?